The hour is late, and the room is suspended in that heavy, amber silence that belongs exclusively to midnight. A solitary figure sits at a polished wooden desk, illuminated only by the amber glow of a single desk lamp. Before them lies a journal filled with frantic, ink-stained pages, proof of a war fought entirely in the theater of the mind. Outside, the world moves with an indifferent, rhythmic calm. Inside, however, the air is thick with the invisible residue of absolute exhaustion. This is the sanctuary of the modern seeker, and it is a place of profound, quiet desperation. Look closer at the scene. The eyes of the seeker are closed tightly, forehead furrowed in an expression of intense concentration. Veins subtly pulse at the temples. Every ounce of human willpower is being summoned, marshaled, and compressed into a single, heroic effort to feel the reality of an unmanifested dream. The mind is a coiled spring, vibrating with tension, desperately trying to bridge the chasms of reality through sheer force of imagination. And then, the quiet snap of reality rushing back in. The eyes fly open. The room has not shifted an inch. The wallpaper is the same shade of muted fatigue. The air carries the same familiar chill. The bank ledger sitting beside the laptop remains unyielding, its figures mocking the invisible labor just performed. Across the room, the chair remains defiantly, hollowly empty. In that precise moment, a cold, familiar voice slips through the cracks of the silence. A whisper born from the dark corners of the human psyche. It isn't working. You aren't doing it right. You haven't felt it enough. If you were truly worthy, or if your faith were strong enough, the walls would have already crumbled. This is the paradox that plagues millions. The harder one tries to invoke peace, abundance, or love, the more elusive it becomes. The attempt to manufacture a divine state through human sweat and mental strain is like trying to catch smoke with bare hands. The very act of grasping disperses the substance. The weight carried into this room is not the weight of circumstance, nor is it the weight of poverty or loneliness. It is the crushing, unbearable weight of trying. To understand why this relentless striving invariably results in spiritual and emotional bankruptcy, one must subject the mechanics of human effort to rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. Why does the act of trying inherently repel the very thing being sought? At the root of the phenomenon lies a fundamental metaphysical misapprehension of what consciousness actually is. When a seeker sits down to make a dream real through forced visualization and heavy affirmations, what is the precise psychological stance they are adopting? By definition, the act of trying implies an existing absence. Recursive thinking reveals the hidden paradox. Why does one try? One tries because one believes a gap exists between the self and the desired object. And how does the mind represent that gap? It represents it as a distance that must be crossed through time, energy, and emotional sweat. Thus, the moment the mind declares, "I must try to feel rich," or "I must force myself to believe I am healed," it has already issued a foundational decree to the subconscious. I am currently lacking. The universe, operating as a flawless mirror of inner assumptions, rather than fleeting outer wishes, reads not the desperate words spoken through clenched teeth, but the underlying psychological premise. It reads the premise of lack. Therefore, the energy of trying acts as an amplifier of distance. It locks the seeker into a perpetual loop of striving, where the goal is always just one more visualization away, forever receding like the horizon before a weary traveler. Philosophically, this error stems from treating the divine or the universal supply as an external commodity that must be conquered or persuaded, rather than an omnipresent environment in which one already lives, moves, and has being. The human ego loves the narrative of the struggle. It derives a perverse sense of virtue from exhaustion. It whispers that if a thing is difficult to attain, it must hold greater value, and if one suffers enough in the pursuit, the cosmos owes a debt of fulfillment. This is the great illusion of spiritual labor. The divine mind does not negotiate with the sweat of the ego. It does not look at the frantic mental acrobatics of a seeker and say, "Because you strained your eyes and wept over your journal for 3 hours, I will finally grant your request." The cosmos responds exclusively to identity. It responds to the quiet, unshakable bedrock of what one accepts as true about oneself now. When the heavy tools of effort are picked up, the tools of peace are necessarily put down. To drop the struggle is not to surrender defeat, it is to recognize that the battle was fought on the wrong terrain entirely. Consider the parable of the architect and the sealed vault. In an ancient, prosperous city by the sea, there lived a master architect named Valerius. Valerius had spent his youth designing magnificent palaces for kings, yet in his old age, he found himself impoverished, living in a modest stone cottage whose roof leaked with every winter storm. One evening, a wandering traveler knocked on his door, carrying a sealed parchment bearing the royal seal. The traveler bowed deeply and said, "Master Valerius, the High King has long admired your past works. He has decreed that you are to be granted the grand estate upon the eastern cliff, a mansion of marble and gold, complete with servants, vineyards, and endless provision. The deed is written. It was registered in the royal archives this very morning." Valerius was overjoyed. He thanked the traveler profusely, accepted the parchment, and placed it upon his wooden table. Yet, as the days passed, Valerius did not leave his damp, leaking cottage. Why? Because when he looked around at his moldering walls and empty hearth, a creeping terror seized his heart. "It looks too much like poverty here," he told himself. "I must make this cottage feel like the grand estate if I am ever to claim it." And so, Valerius began a frantic, obsessive ritual. Every morning, he would close his eyes, grit his teeth, and try with every fiber of his being to imagine the smell of polished marble. He would shout affirmations to the empty stone walls. "I am wealthy. I live in a palace of gold." He would huff and puff, sweating through his tunic, attempting to manufacture the emotional ecstasy of a king while shivering in his damp rags. Weeks bled into months. Valerius grew thin, pale, and deeply depressed. One afternoon, a young apprentice walked into the cottage, found the old architect weeping at his table amidst crumpled papers, and asked gently, "Master, why do you torture yourself so? You have the royal parchment right there." Valerius sobbed, "You do not understand. I try to feel like I am in the mansion, but when I open my eyes, this wretched damp room is still here. I am failing to produce the proper feeling. The king's gift feels like a ghost I am trying to catch with my bare hands." The apprentice smiled softly, walked past the weeping architect, reached out, and unlatched the heavy wooden front door of the cottage, which had been bolted shut against the wind for 20 years. Sunlight flooded the dark room, revealing a wide, paved pathway leading straight up the green hill toward the gleaming white marble gates of the estate, which sat in plain sight just a few hundred yards away. "Master," the apprentice whispered, "you have been treating your inheritance like a phantom because you refuse to look through the door that is already open. You do not need to turn this cottage into a palace. You only need to walk out of it." Valerius stared down the sunlit path. The realization struck him with the force of a revelation. He had spent his entire life building the walls of his own prison through the sheer, exhausting effort of trying to escape it. The transition from the exhaustion of striving to the sovereignty of acceptance begins with a single, uncompromising inward pivot. It requires the seeker to look at the battlefield of their mind, drop the heavy weapons of forced emotion, and exhale. To apply this truth today is remarkably simple, yet it demands a radical departure from everything the modern productivity-obsessed world teaches. It means recognizing that whatever good you desire, whether it be restoration of health, the mending of a relationship, or the arrival of financial flow, is not a distant peak to be climbed through mental athletics. It is an environment waiting to be occupied. When you wake tomorrow and the old fears chatter at the edge of your consciousness, do not marshal your mental armies to fight them. Do not scream affirmations into the mirror with a furrowed brow. Instead, pause, acknowledge the tension in your shoulders, and deliberately choose to set down the burden. Speak to your own soul with the calm authority of an owner returning home. The search is over. The work of striving is finished. The shift is subtle, yet it alters the architecture of destiny. You are no longer a construction worker trying to hammer together a fragile existence out of raw, resistant materials. You are an heir, standing at the threshold of a house that was built for you before the foundation of the world was laid. Yet, as the heavy door of struggle swings open, a deeper mystery emerges from the shadows. If the good already exists in the unseen, waiting for your acceptance rather than your exertion, who is the one who prepares the banquet? And what is the precise nature of the divine mind that holds your name upon the place card? The answers to these questions lie across the threshold, waiting in the next chapter, where the illusion of the lonely creator dissolves forever into the reality of the divine inheritance. The great hall is vast, silent, and steeped in the quiet majesty of a dawn that has broken long before the eyes of men opened to see it. Imagine walking through the arched stone corridors of a palace untouched by human decay. The floor is polished obsidian, reflecting a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations that pulse with a soft, steady light. There is no sound of labor here, no echoes of hammers striking iron, no frantic shouts of foremen, no smell of sweat or burning coal. Instead, the air carries the rich, warm scent of roasted meats, fresh bread, and crushed spices. Down the center of the hall stretches an immense mahogany table, polished to a mirror sheen. Upon it rest golden goblets filled with deep crimson wine, crystal platters heaped with rare fruits, and heavy silver candelabras casting a warm, flickering glow across every inch of the immaculate surface. At the head of the table sits a high-backed throne of carved ivory, and resting precisely upon the place card at that seat is a name etched not in fading ink, but in shimmering gold leaf. It is your name. Yet, step back from this vision and look at the strange theater occurring just outside the heavy oak doors of the banquet hall. Millions of seekers are huddled in the cold mud of the outer courtyard, clutching worn-out blueprints and rusty hammers. Their hands are blistered, their brows are furrowed with deep lines of perpetual anxiety. They are huffing and puffing, blowing hot air onto cold bricks, desperately trying to construct a tiny, makeshift shelter out of dirt and twigs. They believe they are master builders working in a terrifying vacuum. They are convinced that if they stop hammering for even a single second, or if they miss a single measurement in their daily affirmations, the universe will forget their address, the divine will strike their name from the ledger, and they will be left to freeze in the dark. Every now and then, one of them pauses, wipes the sweat from their eyes, and shouts up at the locked oak doors. Can you hear me? Am I working hard enough? Am I visualizing the bricks with enough intensity? Inside the hall, the silence remains unbroken, save for the crackle of the hearth and the gentle bubbling of wine. The feast is already prepared. The warmth is already radiating. The seat is vacant, waiting only for someone to stop building a hovel outside and walk through the unlocked door to claim a throne. To dismantle the psychological trap of spiritual labor, one must examine the precise architecture of the human ego. Why does the mind instinctively recoil from the idea of inheritance, preferring instead the backbreaking labor of self-creation? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the root of human spiritual anxiety. Why do seekers cling so desperately to the belief that they must construct their reality from scratch? Because the ego derives its entire identity from the narrative of earned struggle. And why does the ego require struggle to validate its existence? Because a self-constructed identity needs proof of its own agency. It measures its worth by the volume of effort expended. When a person believes they are a construction worker in the spiritual realm, they are operating under a deeply ingrained materialist philosophy. Nothing comes from nothing, and everything requires a physical or mental equivalent of force to manifest. If you want a house, you must lay the foundation. If you want wealth, you must sweat for every coin. Therefore, when these individuals encounter metaphysical laws, the truths that consciousness is the only reality, they unconsciously smuggle their materialism right back into the teaching. They translate the effortless law of assumption into a new, more grueling form of mental labor. They think, instead of hammering wood, I must now hammer my mind. I must visualize for hours. I must maintain a high emotional vibration every second of the day, or else I fail. Ask a deeper question. How does this mental labor distort the nature of the divine mind? When a seeker worries that missing an affirmation will cause the universe to forget their address, they are projecting human frailty onto the infinite. They are imagining the divine mind as a distracted bureaucrat sitting in a cosmic office, buried under a mountain of petitions, easily prone to clerical error if the applicant fails to fill out the form with absolute emotional precision. Philosophically, this is an inversion of reality. The divine mind does not operate on memory or petition. It operates as an eternal, omnipresent substance that already contains every conceivable good. The good is not being built from the ground up by your mental strain. It is being lowered into your visibility by your acceptance. Think of sunlight. Does the sun strain, sweat, or huff and puff to illuminate a dark room? Does the sun worry that if it flickers for a millisecond, the room will permanently forget what light looks like? No. The sun simply radiates its nature, and the room becomes illuminated the moment the blinds are drawn open. Your good already exists in the divine mind in its entirety. When you attempt to force it into existence through intense, white-knuckled mental exertion, you are acting like a man who stands in a sunlit meadow at noon, holding a tiny candle up to the sky and screaming at the sun to shine brighter. You are exhausting yourself trying to manufacture what is already bathing you from above. Consider the historical precedent of the young Prince of Mercia, chronicled in the ancient chronicles of the northern realms. Prince Ethelred was stolen away from the royal cradle in his infancy by a band of wandering mercenaries during a midnight raid. Raised deep within the remote mountain forests, he grew up believing he was a peasant orphan. He wore rough animal skins, slept on a bed of damp pine needles, and spent his days hauling heavy logs up steep mountain passes for the local charcoal burners. Ethelred was known throughout the mountain villages as the hardest worker in the province. His hands were calloused, his back was permanently bent from carrying burdens far too heavy for his frame, and his eyes were always fixed on the dirt, searching for the next fallen branch to drag back to the camp. One winter evening, an aging knight clad in silver armor rode up the mountain trail, flanked by royal guards. The knight stopped before Ethelred, who was currently straining under the weight of an immense oak trunk. His face purple with exhaustion, the knight dismounted, fell to one knee in the mud, and said, "My liege, the king is dead. You are the sole surviving heir to the throne of Mercia. The crown awaits you in the capital. The great palace is heated by 1,000 fires, and the royal treasuries are overflowing." Ethelred dropped the oak trunk into the mud, backed away in terror, and clutched his ragged furs tighter around his shoulders. "You mock me," he spat, his voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. "I am no prince. Look at me, I am a woodcutter. I have earned every scrap of calloused skin on my hands. If I do not carry these logs today, I will starve. Do not speak to me of palaces and crowns. I must finish hauling this timber before nightfall, or the master will beat me." The knight sighed softly, stood up, and pointed down the mountain valley toward the glittering spires of the capital city visible on the horizon. "Prince," the knight said gently, "you think you are a laborer who must build your way into royalty through the sweat of your back, but you were born in the palace. The blood of kings flows in your veins. You do not need to earn the crown, you only need to stop picking up the logs." Ethelred stood frozen in the freezing mud. The weight of his entire life, the endless hauling, the straining muscles, the terror of not being enough clashed violently with the quiet majesty of the knight's words. Slowly, deliberately, the young man let go of the rope tied to the oak trunk. He straightened his back, uncramped his fingers, and took his first step down the mountain trail, leaving the woodcutter's axe behind in the dirt. He did not feel like a king yet. His shoulders still ached, and his boots were still caked in mud. But the destination was fixed, and the throne was already empty, waiting for its rightful master to sit down. To integrate this truth into your daily walk, you must perform a radical inventory of your spiritual life. Where are you still hauling logs? Where are you still acting as a construction worker in a realm where you have already been named an heir? Examine the areas of your life marked by chronic struggle, whether in your finances, your creative endeavors, or your personal bonds. Look closely at the mental friction you experience daily. That tightness in your chest, that frantic inner monologue calculating how you are going to fix your life, is the exact equivalent of Prince Ethelred gripping the woodcutter's rope while the royal carriage idles at the edge of the camp. Today, you are invited to drop the rope. You do not need to construct a new life out of raw anxiety and mental sweat. The blueprint has already been drawn by the infinite. The feast has already been laid upon the table. As you move through your day, whenever the old urge to huff and puff arises, whenever you catch yourself frantically trying to force an outcome through sheer mental horsepower, pause. Take a slow, deep breath. Remind yourself of your true lineage. Say quietly to the rushing noise of your own mind, I am not a builder trying to earn my keep. I am an heir walking home. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands open. Feel the strange, unsettling, yet deeply liberating sensation of stepping out of the mud and onto the paved marble path. Yet, as the heavy wooden doors of the courtyard swing wide open, a profound realization dawns. If the palace is real and the feast is waiting, why does the outer world often look so stubbornly resistant to your new identity? Why does the mirror of life still reflect the old rags when you feel the royal velvet brushing against your skin? The answer lies just ahead, waiting in the silver glass of the next chapter, where the laws of reflection and the mysteries of the mirror are laid bare before your eyes. The chamber is bathed in the cool, silver twilight of dawn. In the center of the room stands an antique, floor-to-ceiling mirror framed in tarnished brass. Its glass clear, uncompromising, and utterly faithful to every detail set before it. Before this looking glass stands a traveler. The traveler's brow is deeply furrowed, lips pressed into a hard, frustrated line of accumulated grief and longing. Staring intently at the glass, the traveler begins to perform a strange, impossible ritual. With white-knuckled intensity, they twist their mouth into an exaggerated, forced smile. They command themselves to beam with radiant joy while the eyes remain heavy with tears and the heart aches with lack. Minute after minute passes. The traveler strains, pouring every ounce of emotional volume into the facial muscles, trying to bully the glass into showing a picture of effortless happiness. Yet, the mirror refuses to cooperate. It does not mock, nor does it judge. It merely obeys with cold, mathematical precision. It reflects back the exact truth of what is happening in the present moment. A scowling brow, a tense jaw, and eyes shining with the frantic panic of someone trying to fake a reality they believe they do not possess. The traveler lets out a ragged, defeated sigh, drops their head, and whispers to the empty room, "See? It is useless. The mirror only shows the misery that is truly there. No matter how hard I try to force a smile upon my face, the glass betrays me." This is the eternal delusion of the unawakened seeker. Humanity stands before the vast, reflective surface of physical existence, scowling at the lack, weeping over the unmoving bank accounts, mourning the empty spaces in their lives, and then screaming at the mirror because the reflection will not change. They do not understand the fundamental law of the looking glass. The mirror has no will of its own. It holds no independent power to create, to alter, or to choose. It is a completely passive servant. It can only, eternally, faithfully repeat what is placed before it. If you stand before the mirror of life with a furrowed brow of wanting, life will show you a world that keeps you wanting. The universe does not respond to your hard work, your volume, or your frantic pleading. It responds entirely to your quiet, unshakable vibration. To master the mechanics of reflection, one must subject the interaction between consciousness and outer reality to rigorous psychological and philosophical deconstruction. Why does the material world act as such a stubborn, delayed mirror, and how does the human mind trap itself in recursive loops of limitation? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the nature of perception. Why do human beings instinctively believe that the outer world is the cause and their internal state is the effect? Because physical evolution conditioned the survival brain to trust tangible sensory input over abstract thought. What can be touched, measured, and seen appears solid, objective, and unchangeable. And how does this sensory dependency create a psychological trap? By treating the physical reflection as the primary reality, the individual surrenders their creative sovereignty to a shadow. When an individual looks at an unpaid bill, an empty chair, or a lagging body, and reacts with fear or despair, they are looking at yesterday's light. They are looking at the echo of past assumptions cast upon the screen of space and time. Recursive thought digs deeper. How does the universe actually process an internal assumption? The universe is non-judgmental. It operates with the cold, majestic neutrality of a law of physics, much like gravity or electromagnetism. It does not evaluate whether your dominant assumption is good or bad, poverty or wealth, sickness or health. It possesses no moral compass of its own. It is an absolute amplifier of inner conviction. If you quietly, unnoticeably accept that life is a struggle, if you wear lack like an old, comfortable, tattered sweater that feels natural to your skin, the universe fulfills that acceptance with mathematical precision. You do not need to huff and puff to be broke. You are already resting comfortably in the assumption of poverty. Philosophically, this reveals why trying to force a positive reflection while maintaining a negative core identity is an exercise in futility. If you stand before a mirror and scowl, but force your lips upward for 3 seconds of intense mental gymnastics, you are sending a mixed signal. The deeper, silent assumption, the underlying vibration of fear and lack is what the mirror registers. The mirror does not read your temporary performance, it reads your permanent residence. Therefore, the secret of the masters is never intensity, it is naturalness. To change the reflection, one must never attack the mirror. One does not smash the glass to fix a crooked tie. One simply steps back, adjusts the tie upon the living form, and lets the glass effortlessly update its testimony. The moment you shift your internal identity, the moment you quietly accept your good as a settled, undeniable fact of your being, the mirror of the world has no choice. It must match you. This is not a miracle defying the laws of nature. It is the ultimate, unyielding law of consciousness in action. Consider the historical account of Master Lucius, an ancient sage of the Eastern kingdoms who served as the royal advisor to a young, tumultuous emperor. When Emperor Darius ascended the throne, the empire was on the brink of civil collapse. Famine plagued the southern provinces, neighboring kingdoms rattled their swords at the borders, and the royal treasuries were choked with debt. Darius was a man of intense passion and desperate energy. Every morning, he would pace the throne room, shouting orders, drafting emergency decrees, and furiously trying to force his generals, merchants, and peasants into submission through sheer volume and royal command. Yet, the more Darius shouted, the more chaotic the empire became. Rebellions flared, merchants hoarded grain, and the court dissolved into whispering factions. One evening, exhausted, hoarse, and trembling with rage, Darius slumped into his throne and demanded of his advisor, Lucius, "Why does my kingdom mock my authority? I work until my fingers bleed. I scream commands until my throat is raw. I try with every ounce of my soul to make this empire prosperous and peaceful, yet every mirror of the realm shows me only treason and ruin." Master Lucius did not offer immediate advice. Instead, he walked silently to the center of the throne room, carrying a massive, heavy brass brazier filled with glowing hot coals. He placed it upon the marble floor. Beside it, he set a polished silver bowl filled with clear, still water. "Majesty," Lucius said softly, his voice calm as a mountain lake. "Look into the silver bowl." Darius leaned forward and peered into the water. His own reflection stared back, sweaty, wild-eyed, and distorted by the flickering heat waves rising from the burning coals. "What do you see?" Lucius asked. "I see a frantic, tortured king, surrounded by fire and smoke," Darius spat. "Now watch the water," Lucius instructed. The sage did not touch the bowl. Instead, he extinguished the hot coals in the brass brazier, plunging the room into a deep, serene stillness. He stepped back, folded his hands within his robes, and stood entirely still, breathing slowly and evenly. As the air in the room cooled, the surface of the silver water stopped rippling. The smoke cleared. The shadows retreated. Slowly, the silver bowl began to reflect the magnificent vaulted arches of the throne room, the golden tapestries, and the calm, dignified posture of the sage standing in quiet peace. Darius stared in astonishment. How did you do that? You did not touch the bowl. You did not rearrange the room. Lucius bowed his head slightly. Majesty, the silver bowl is the empire. The fire was your frantic, desperate striving. You spent your days screaming at your own reflection, trying to force the water to look peaceful while your own heart was a raging furnace of panic. The world is a faithful servant. It cannot show peace while you project turmoil. The moment you became still within yourself, the mirror of the empire had no choice. It simply mirrored your peace. Darius sat back in his throne, the lesson sinking deep into his bones. He stopped shouting. He stopped drafting frantic decrees. He spent 3 days in absolute silence, quietly anchoring the assumption of a prosperous, ordered realm within his own mind. By the 4th morning, couriers arrived from the southern provinces bearing news of unexpected bumper harvests, and ambassadors from the borderlands arrived uninvited, bearing offers of peace and trade. The mirror had shifted because the man before it had stopped fighting his own reflection. To bring this ancient truth into the fabric of your daily life, you must cease your war with the mirror of your circumstances. When you awaken tomorrow morning and the physical world presents you with the familiar sights of limitation, when the bank balance shows the same sparse figures, or when the body whispers its usual discomfort, recognize it instantly for what it is. An echo, a shadow, yesterday's light traveling across the vast expanse of time to reach your eyes today. Do not argue with yesterday's newspaper. Do not stand before the mirror of your life and scowl, trying to force a smile through clenched teeth. Instead, step back. Breathe. Anchor yourself in the quiet conviction that your good is already prepared in the divine mind. When the outer world displays lack, say to yourself with the absolute, boring certainty of a homeowner who knows his roof is intact, that is an old shadow. My reality is already settled under grace. The shift is absolute. When you stop trying to manipulate the reflection aligns itself to your sovereign identity. Yet, as the frantic struggle dissolves into this deep, immovable peace, a vital question rises from the quietude. If the shift is not an emotional high or a mountaintop frenzy, what does true answered prayer actually feel like? How does a master inhabit a reality that has not yet materialized in the physical domain? The answer awaits across the threshold of the next chapter, where the lost art of naturalness and the profound relief of the Valley of Peace are finally unveiled. The evening descends upon the city with the quiet weight of a velvet curtain falling on an empty stage. Inside a secluded home, a traveler returns from a long, grueling journey across foreign lands. The front door clicks shut, sealing out the damp chill of the night air. Observe the scene with the eye of a silent observer. There is no gasping in theatrical surprise. There is no frantic rush to verify that the walls are still standing. It's no anxious search for the deed of ownership to confirm that the roof hasn't vanished into the ether. The traveler simply walks into the hallway, kicks off travel-worn boots with an easy, unthinking familiarity, and hangs the heavy cloak upon its accustomed peg. There is an absolute quiet boredom in the movement, the supreme, unshakable boredom of absolute ownership. The traveler does not spend the evening pacing the floorboards, chanting affirmations to convince themselves that they live here. They do not stare at the kitchen counter with wide, manic eyes, trying to force the feeling of domestic security through sheer emotional intensity. They walk to the stove, light a burner to warm a pot of tea, and settle into an old, deep armchair with a soft, long-delayed sigh. This is the hidden paradox of human desire. The things you desperately chase through emotional fireworks and manic intensity are the very things you push away by your frantic striving. Look at the seeker who attempts to manifest peace or abundance. They treat the desire like a rare, wild beast. They must stalk through the mental jungle, leaping from emotional mountaintop to mountaintop, screaming mantras into the void, convinced that if their vibration drops for even a single second, the prize will vanish. Yet, true answered prayer possesses none of this frantic theatricality. It does not feel like a lightning strike or an ecstatic fever. It feels remarkably, quietly ordinary. It feels like home. It is the deep, steady peace that follows the storm. The flat, calm certainty of a name stated when asked, requiring no visualization, no sweat, and no proof. To comprehend why naturalness outshines intensity in the architecture of manifestation, one must subject the dynamics of human emotion and belief to a rigorous philosophical and psychological autopsy. Why does the human ego instinctively equate volume with power, and why does true spiritual law demand precisely the opposite? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the mechanics of emotional frequency. Why do seekers believe they must maintain a state of high emotional ecstasy to manifest their dreams? Because the ego operates under a scarcity paradigm. It assumes that because a goal feels large and distant to the current self, an equally large and dramatic emotional explosion is required to bridge the gap. And how does this psychological assumption sabotage the creative process? By introducing internal resistance. When an individual forces themselves into a state of manic, emotional high-screaming, "I am wealthy," while their stomach churns with rent anxiety, the mind experiences a profound internal split. Recursive questioning reveals the deeper layer. What does the mind actually register during this performance? It registers the discrepancy. The frantic emotional volume is interpreted by the subconscious not as confidence but as a defense mechanism against an underlying terror of lack. The louder you scream in affirmation, the more clearly your subconscious hears the whisper of its opposite. If I didn't doubt it, I wouldn't have to shout it so loudly. Philosophically, this exposes the core difference between wishing and knowing. When you truly know something, you stop thinking about it constantly, you start thinking from it. Consider a person who holds $1 million securely in an established bank account. Do they wake up every single morning, leap out of bed with tears of ecstatic joy, and scream at the ceiling, "I have money, I have money"? No. Such behavior would mark a mind gripped by psychosis or profound insecurity. The wealthy person brushes their teeth, drinks their coffee, and worries about what to wear to a meeting because the fact of their financial security is so deeply woven into their baseline identity that it requires no emotional maintenance. It has achieved the status of naturalness. The divine mind does not respond to the dramatic pyrotechnics of the ego. It responds to the quiet baseline of your accepted identity. When an assumption becomes natural to you, when you can think about your desire with the same dull, unshakable, matter-of-fact boredom with which you think about the color of your own eyes, or the existence of your own living room walls, the universe yields. It must. Nature abhors a vacuum, but it respects a settled fact. To shift from the mountaintop high of emotional striving to the valley deep of natural certainty is to cross the threshold from amateur wishing into master creation. You are no longer acting like a beggar trying to storm the castle gates with fireworks. You are the sovereign who walks through the courtyard, barely noticing the marble beneath your feet because it has always belonged to you. Scene 3. The allegory. Case. Consider the historical account of Master Kalin, an apprentice glassblower in the ancient island city of Tyre, who sought to master the legendary royal amber, a glass so pure and luminous it was said to capture the light of the setting sun and hold it eternally within its core. For 7 years, Kalin labored in the royal furnaces. He was a man of intense passion and volatile moods. On days when he felt inspired, he would stoke the fires with reckless abandon, shouting prayers to the gods of fire, weeping over his molds, and trying to force the molten glass into perfection through sheer emotional fervor. Yet, every single piece he blew either shattered under the thermal shock or emerged cloudy, warped, and fractured. The master artisan of the guild, an old man named Theron, whose hands were scarred, and whose movements were as smooth and uneventful as the rolling tide, watched Kalin's frantic efforts with quiet pity. One evening, after another batch of glass had exploded in the kiln, Kalin fell to his knees in the ash, sobbing with exhaustion. "I give up," he cried. "I have poured my heart's blood into these fires. I have felt every ecstasy of creation. Why does the glass reject me? Why does the royal amber elude my hands? Theron walked slowly across the workshop, handed the young apprentice a simple clay cup of cool water, and sat down on a wooden bench beside him. Kaelin, Theron said softly, his voice lacking any trace of strain. Why do you huff and puff at the furnace like a man trying to blow out the sun? You treat the glass like an enemy you must conquer with your passion. I am trying to make it beautiful. Kaelin protested, wiping soot from his eyes. I am trying to force it to be magnificent. That is your error, Theron replied, pointing a scarred finger toward the window where the ocean met the horizon. Look at the sea. Does the ocean scream at the shore to make the waves rise? Does the sun sweat to bring the morning? The royal amber is not created by the intensity of your desire. It is born from the naturalness of your hand. You do not think about how to hold the blowpipe. You simply hold it as you hold your own arm. Until the creation of the amber becomes as ordinary to your soul as breathing is to your lungs, the fires will continue to break your work. Theron stood up, walked to the furnace which burned with a low, steady, almost imperceptible blue flame, took a modest iron rod, and dipped it into the pot with an economy of motion so effortless it looked like sleep. Without a single word of prayer, without a grimace of strain, without a flicker of emotional theater, he blew a single breath into the pipe. 10 minutes later, he lifted out a glob of glass that radiated a warm, golden, unbroken sunfire, flawless, perfect, and deeply serene. Kaelin stared at the masterpiece, dumbfounded. He realized in that instant that his spiritual and artistic struggles were identical. He had been using emotional violence where he should have been cultivating quiet, boring, absolute familiarity. He stopped shouting at the kilns. He stopped trying to feel ecstatic. He spent 3 days sitting quietly in the dust, letting the idea of the amber become completely natural to his mind, till he could picture himself holding it without his heart rate even shifting a beat. When he finally returned to the pipe, his hands did not tremble. The glass did not break. The royal amber was born, not from a mountaintop high, but from the deep, immovable valley of peace. To integrate the power of naturalness into your life today, you must abandon the exhausting pursuit of spiritual highs. Stop demanding of yourself that you feel ecstatic, electrified, or supernaturally elevated every time you contemplate your dream. That is the trap of the seeker who still believes the goal is miles away. Instead, seek the mundane peace of the answered prayer. If your desire were already a settled fact, if your body were already healed, if your bank balance were already secured, if your partnership were already established, how would you feel right now? Would you be jumping up and down? Would you be frantically reminding yourself of your worth every 5 minutes? No, you would be calm. You would be slightly bored by the thought, because it would simply be a part of your normal landscape. You would be thinking about what to make for dinner, or how to spend your afternoon, or what book to read next. As you move through your day, whenever you catch yourself straining, forcing, or working yourself into an emotional frenzy over your desires, catch the tension. Drop your shoulders. Exhale the performance. Speak to your mind with the flat, calm certainty of an owner returning to a familiar house. It is settled. It is done. It is already mine. The shift is profound. When naturalness replaces intensity, the resistance of the outer world dissolves into mist. If you are ready to trade the exhausting roller coaster of emotional highs and lows for the steady, unshakable power of natural conviction, pause here. Tap the like button as a quiet, definitive declaration that you are stepping out of the theater of striving and into the calm valley of answered prayer. Yet, as you settle into this deep valley of peace, a new and vital question arises from the stillness. If the internal state is now calm and natural, how do we handle the specific, practical moments of transition? How do we build the bridge between the invisible reality of the mind and the visible theater of daily life without falling back into old habits of doubt? The answers await across the threshold of the next chapter, where the lost art of remaining in character is revealed to those who dare to wear the royal robes before the world has even noticed the crown. The backstages of the Grand Theater are swallowed in deep, velvety shadows, smelling faintly of old dust, scorched hemp ropes, and the metallic tang of grease paint. A lone actor sits before a chipped wooden dressing table lit by a ring of flickering tungsten bulbs. The mirror reflects a face worn thin by years of playing minor, tragic roles, characters burdened with perpetual poverty, betrayal, and unyielding despair. For decades, the actor has worn the ragged, patched burlap of a beggar. The lines of want are so deeply etched into the performance that they have begun to feel like bone. Tonight, however, the script has changed. The director has handed the actor a new parchment or royal decree and cast them in the role of the sovereign. Resting across the back of the chair are the vestments of a king, heavy crimson velvet lined with ermine, a chest plate of chased gold, and a heavy crown wrought of cold metal studded with dark rubies. With trembling fingers, the actor stands and drapes the velvet over shoulders still caked in the dust of the old character. The weight is immediately staggering. The crown feels awkward and heavy upon the brow. The stiff folds of the velvet refuse to drape naturally. The boots feel clumsy and oversized. When the actor steps out from the wings and onto the floodlit stage, a ripple of nervous laughter runs through the empty house. Every nerve screams that it is a fraud. An imposter playing dress-up beneath a glaring spotlight. Behind the stage wings, the stagehands are already moving the props of the old scene away, hauling the beggar's crate and the broken stool into the darkness. The physical stage is half finished, littered with exposed nails and scaffolding. And right there, in the dangerous vacuum between the old world that has just vanished and the new world that has not yet materialized in full view, lies the ultimate test of manifestation. Most actors panic at this precise moment. They feel the heavy crown slipping. They hear the ego laughing from the dark, and they tear off the velvet in humiliation, running back to the dressing room to put the rags back on, crying that it felt too fake, too unnatural, too impossible to sustain. Yet, the master actor knows a profound secret. The crown never feels light on the first night. The velvet always feels stiff before it is broken in by the body. To manifest a new reality, one must refuse to step out of character simply because the stagehands are still shifting the props. To understand why the human mind violently rejects a new identity shift, one must subject the psychology of ego protection and identity maintenance to a rigorous philosophical breakdown. Why does stepping into a higher version of oneself feel so profoundly like acting, like fraudulence, and like an unbearable strain? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the mechanics of self-image. Why does the human ego protest against an upgraded reality? Because the ego is fundamentally an archive of past references. It defines safety as what is familiar, predictable, and historically verified. And how does the ego react when presented with an identity that has no historical precedent in the personal timeline? It labels that new identity as a dangerous illusion, a lie, or an act of madness. When a person who has known only lack, struggle, or chronic illness attempts to assume the identity of wealth, wholeness, or sovereignty, the ego immediately sounds the alarm. It fires signals of discomfort through the nervous system, creating the subjective feeling of imposter syndrome. Recursive questioning digs deeper. Why does this imposter feeling trick so many seekers into abandoning their practice? Because the uninitiated seeker mistakenly believes that the feeling of fakeness is proof of failure. They think, if I feel like I am pretending to be rich, it means I am not rich, and therefore the law is not working. This is the great psychological trap. Philosophy and depth psychology reveal that every profound transformation begins in the theater of the as-if. When an individual learns a new language, plays a new instrument, or steps into a leadership role, there is an unavoidable transitional phase where the mechanics feel mechanical, stiff, and unnatural. The child learning to walk does not abandon the effort because the first steps feel awkward. They continue stumbling forward until the new neural pathway is forged. The divine mind does not judge the awkwardness of your early steps. It honors the persistence of your occupancy. If you put on the royal robes of your new identity and immediately rip them off the moment your ego whispers fraud, you reinforce the old script. You are like an actor who refuses to finish the play because the first scene felt unfamiliar. To To remain in character means to understand that the feeling of pretending is simply the friction of an old neural identity dying while a new divine identity is being born. You are not trying to become the sovereign. You are simply occupying the sovereign until the role wears in, the velvet softens, and the crown fits as though it were molded from birth. Consider the historical precedent of Aurelius, a humble shepherd boy in the ancient hill country of Dacia, who was chosen by the High Council to be crowned king following a prophetic dream that swept through the provinces. Aurelius had never seen a city, let alone a palace. His hands were stained with lanolin and scarred by briars. His speech was rough with the dialect of the sheepfolds. When the royal escort arrived at his pasture with silk tunics, golden signet rings, and a battalion of armored guards, Aurelius shrank back against a stone wall, shaking his head in absolute terror. "You are making a grave mistake," he stammered, pulling his rough woolen cloak around his shoulders. "I am a keeper of sheep. I know nothing of laws, courtrooms, or gold. If I sit upon the lion throne, everyone will see that I am a peasant in stolen clothes. It is a lie. I cannot play this part." The captain of the guard, an aging veteran with a face carved from granite, stepped forward, placed a heavy gold-hilted sword into Aurelius's trembling hands, and said quietly, "Boy, a king is not made by the softness of his hands, but by the unyielding occupancy of his seat. When the true king arrives in the capital tonight, the courtiers will test you. They will whisper behind your back. They will watch how you hold your cup. If you let their glances make you feel like an imposter, you will strip off the crown yourself and run back to the hills. But if you remain in character, if you refuse to step out of the royal persona, no matter how heavy the velvet feels upon your sunburned shoulders, the crown will eventually grow into your brow, and the people will forget you ever held a crook." Aurelius was taken to the marble palace. That first night, seated at the great banquet table under the gaze of hundreds of skeptical nobles, he felt like a wretched ghost haunting a king's body. Every time he lifted a silver goblet, his hand shook. Every time a lord bowed, his face burned with the hot shame of a fraud. His ego screamed at him to rip off the silk, put on his sheepskins, and flee back to the safety of the dark hills. Yet, remembering the captain's words, Aurelius clamped his jaw shut, straightened his spine, and refused to break character. When he spoke, he forced his voice to remain steady, even when his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Weeks turned into months. The awkwardness slowly dissolved. The silk tunic stopped feeling like a costume and began to feel like a second skin. The courtiers stopped whispering because the man sitting on the throne no longer projected the vibration of a frightened shepherd. He projected the silent, immovable gravity of a sovereign. The role had become the reality. To embody this truth today, you must examine where you are currently breaking character in the play of your own life. When you make a bold internal decree that your life has changed, that abundance, health, or love is now your settled baseline, how long do you maintain the posture before the first external crosswind knocks you off balance? Do you hold the royal posture for 10 minutes of meditation, only to drop it the moment an unpleasant email lands in your inbox? Do you put on the velvet of peace, only to tear it off in a panic the moment an old financial fear whispers in the dark? Today, make the sacred commitment to remain in character. Understand that when the old world protests, when the stagehands of your life are moving the old props away and the new set looks bare, your ego will laugh at you and call you a fool. It will whisper that you are pretending, that you are lying to yourself, that you are foolish to act as though your good is already secured while the physical evidence looks bleak. Smile at the ego's panic. Let it chatter. Do not fight it, and above all, do not take off the crown. Continue walking through your day with the quiet dignity of one who knows the script has changed. The transition is absolute. When you refuse to break character, the external reality is forced to rewrite its lines to match your performance. Yet, as the new role settles into your bones, as a vital practical question arises. How do we transition this majestic theory into a concrete daily rhythm? And how do we move from the philosophy of sovereignty into the precise, effortless execution of the 3 steps of quiet acceptance? The blueprint awaits across the threshold of the next chapter, where the machinery of the restored afternoon, the night garment, and the refusal of appearances are laid out with absolute clarity. The afternoon sun filters through the ancient weeping willows that drape over the edge of a tranquil, glass-clear lake. The air is warm, fragrant with the earthy scent of damp loam and blooming clover, and hushed by the lazy drone of distant dragonflies skimming the water's surface. In this timeless space sits a traveler, resting comfortably upon a polished stone bench. There is no frantic urgency in the traveler's posture, no map spread across the knees, no compass being frantically consulted. The eyes are relaxed, tracking the gentle descent of a golden autumn leaf drifting down to rest upon the ripples of the shore. This is the sanctuary of the restored afternoon, a scene of such utter ordinariness that it feels almost scandalous to the mind trained on perpetual hustle. Look closer at the paradox unfolding in this quiet landscape. The human mind has been systematically poisoned by the cultural myth that greatness requires explosions of adrenaline, dramatic plot twists, and heroic feats of emotional acrobatics. When seekers are told to imagine their dreams fulfilled, their imaginations instantly leap to catastrophic heights. Winning fortunes in roaring casinos, accepting standing ovations in grand auditoriums, or orchestrating sweeping, cinematic romances that defy the stars. Yet, when the brain attempts to swallow these colossal, explosive fantasies, it chokes on its own resistance. The logical intellect immediately activates its defense systems, flashing warning lights and demanding, "How? When? With what money?" That is impossible. The dramatic explosion triggers a civil war within the psyche, setting off alarm bells of doubt that instantly crush the seed of the desire. True manifestation does not live in the blinding flash of the pyrotechnic explosion. It lives in the quiet, boring, exquisitely ordinary moments that naturally follow the fulfillment of a dream. It lives in the silence, after the applause has died down. In the simple sensory details of an afternoon where the struggle is already a forgotten relic of yesterday. To master the mechanics of deliberate creation without burning out the nervous system, one must subject the architecture of mental visualization to a rigorous psychological and philosophical breakdown. Why do grand, dramatic visualizations trigger fierce internal resistance, while mundane, after-moment scenes slip past the defenses of the ego with effortless grace? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the inner workings of imagination. Why does the ego fiercely resist imagining massive windfalls or radical life transformations? Because the ego measures reality through historical contrast. If you are currently sitting in a room filled with debt, and you try to imagine yourself as a billionaire standing on a mega yacht, your subconscious instantly measures the chasm between your current baseline and that absurd fantasy, screaming that you are lying to yourself. And how does the mind react to this internal lie? It generates intense resistance, anxiety, and a renewed conviction of lack. When a seeker attempts to visualize the dramatic climax of their dream, they are focusing on the result while still standing in the emotional shoes of the seeker. Recursive questioning digs deeper. How do we bypass this psychological tripwire? By shifting the target of imagination from the climax to the aftermath. If a desire were already fulfilled, if health, wealth, or love were already your permanent, settled reality, you would not be walking around all day thinking about the miracle of its arrival. You would be doing something utterly mundane. If you were completely healed of a chronic ailment, you wouldn't spend your afternoon weeping tears of gratitude over your liver. You would be walking through a park, feeling the sun on your face, casually wondering what to prepare for dinner. If you were 6 months into a thriving, harmonious relationship, you wouldn't be staring at your wedding ring in wide-eyed awe every 5 minutes. You would be sitting on the sofa, sharing a quiet cup of tea or a comfortable silence with your partner. Philosophically, this reveals why the restored afternoon is the master key of practical metaphysics. The subconscious mind does not process scale, it processes feeling, tone, and naturalness. When you select an ordinary, boring after moment, you trick the vigilant ego. The ego's alarm bells remain silent because there is nothing threatening or impossible about walking through a park or sitting on a sofa. Yet, within that quiet, unassuming mental scene lies the entire frequency of the fulfilled desire. By occupying that ordinary moment tonight, you lay down the heavy tools of effort and step effortlessly into the three-step architecture of quiet acceptance, selecting the after moment, putting on the new garment before sleep, and masterfully refusing the false testimony of outer appearances. Consider the historical account of Master Ewan, the royal orchardist of the Scottish Highlands, whose apples were legendary throughout the kingdom for their massive size, rich sweetness, and flawless skins, even during years of bitter frost, when every other orchard in the realm withered into dust. When young apprentices came to Ewan to learn his secret, they expected ancient rituals, secret fertilizers, or complex astronomical calculations. Instead, they found an old man who spent most of his time sitting on a wooden bench, smoking a clay pipe, and watching the clouds roll over the hills. One spring, a devastating late frost swept through the valley, blackening the buds across the land. The junior orchardists panicked. They ran through the groves with torches, threw blankets over the frozen saplings, and shouted incantations to the wind, sweating and straining to force the trees to stay warm. Ewan sat quietly on his bench, smoking his pipe, and watching them with serene indifference. An exhausted apprentice ran up to him, covered in soot and shivering with cold, crying, "Master, the frost is killing the orchard. Why aren't you helping us? Why aren't you building fires or wrapping the branches? If we don't force these trees to produce, we will all starve next winter." Ewan calmly removed the pipe from his mouth, blew a thin ring of white smoke into the cold air, and pointed to a massive, ancient apple tree standing undisturbed at the center of the grove. "Boy," Ewan said quietly, "look at that tree. Does it look like it is panicking? Does it huff and puff to bring forth the harvest?" "No," the apprentice stammered, "but the frost is merely yesterday's weather." Ewan interrupted softly. "You young men are like frantic fools trying to pull the apples out of the branches with your bare hands before the blossoms have even fallen. You try to force the harvest by attacking the tree. I do not fight the frost. I sit here and picture the autumn. I see the baskets lined up in the shed, heavy with red fruit. I smell the cider pressing in the dark barn. I occupy the after moment, the quiet, ordinary Tuesday in October when the harvest is already a settled, boring fact. When you plant that image in the silent earth of your mind and leave it alone, the tree does not need your sweat. It obeys the invisible law." The apprentice scoffed, believing the old man had lost his mind to age. He returned to his frantic torch-bearing and blanket-tugging, working himself into a fever of exhaustion until his hands blistered and his heart grew heavy with despair. When autumn arrived, every single tree tended by the frantic apprentices was barren, twisted by the frost and ruined by over-manipulation. But at the center of the valley stood Ewan's ancient tree, its boughs weighed down so heavily with monumental, ruby-red apples that wooden props had to be rushed in to keep the branches from snapping. The master had not fought the winter. He had simply lived in the autumn before the seed had even broken the soil. To bring this majestic architecture into your daily existence, you must master the 3 precise steps of quiet acceptance as you close your eyes tonight. Step 1. The selection of the after moment. Abandon the grand, explosive fantasies that trigger your logical mind's alarms. Do not try to visualize winning $1 million or standing on a mountaintop of triumph. Instead, find one ordinary, quiet, mundane moment that would naturally follow the fulfillment of your desire. Hear the voice of a trusted friend saying, "You look so peaceful lately. Everything really worked out, didn't it?" Or feel the simple physical sensation of your own shoulders dropping as you wash the dishes in a home that is entirely secure. Step 2. The putting on of the new garment. As you lie upon your bed tonight, do not pray with the desperate plea of, "Please let this happen." Simply enter that quiet after moment. Slip into it like a tailored velvet garment that belongs to you. At first, it may feel slightly unfamiliar like new cloth that has not yet been broken in by the weather, but do not take it off. Let your subconscious mind soak in the rich, heavy relief of knowing the search is over. You aren't trying to go home, you are already there. Step 3. The refusal of appearances. This is where the battle is won or lost. When you open your eyes tomorrow morning, the old world will still be whispering its familiar lies. The bills may still sit on the kitchen counter, the body may still carry its old ache, the silence of the room may still feel heavy. Most seekers look at this husk of the old world and cry, "It didn't work." You must be like the orchardist. You do not dig up the seed in the dark earth to check if it is growing. You recognize that the world you see with your physical eyes today is merely the shadow light of yesterday's beliefs. You do not argue with yesterday's newspaper, you simply move the light. When lack knocks at your door tomorrow, look it in the eye and say with the unshakable boredom of an owner, "That is an old shadow. My reality is already prepared in the divine mind, appearing now under grace." The shift is absolute. When you master these 3 steps, striving ceases, and manifestation becomes as inevitable as the changing of the seasons. Yet, as the seed takes root in the silent soil of your consciousness, a profound and mysterious question arises. How do we anchor this invisible shift with the explosive, transformative power of the spoken word? What are the exact decrees that set the law of the universe into motion without disturbing the deep peace of the valley? The answers await across the threshold of the next chapter, where your word becomes your wand, and decrees are spoken not as pleas to a distant sky, but as the sovereign commands of an awakened soul. The morning air is crisp, carrying the pale, silver mist of dawn before the sun has fully crested the horizon. In a high-arched stone chamber overlooking a silent, sleeping city, a seeker stands before an open casement window. There is no sign of panic in this room. No frantic scribbling in journals. No desperate weeping. Instead, the figure stands completely still, eyes open and gazing outward with a calm, penetrating focus. In the quiet hush of the morning, a voice breaks the stillness. It is not raised in a frantic plea, nor does it tremble with uncertainty. It is spoken with the deep, resonant gravity of a judge rendering a final verdict. I am divinely guided to my perfect place, among my perfect people, doing my perfect work for my perfect pay. I give thanks that my good now flows to me in a steady, unbroken, ever-increasing stream of success, and I accept it now. Listen closely to the sound of those words as they ripple out into the morning air. They do not bounce off the walls as empty echoes. They carry a distinct, physical weight, like heavy iron bars sliding smoothly into place within a massive, golden lock. This is the central paradox of the spoken word. The human tongue is often used as an instrument of destruction, a weapon of accidental self-sabotage, yet when it is anchored in silent acceptance, it becomes the wand that transmutes chaos into divine order. Most people use their words as passive commentators on their misery. They wake up and recite a litany of complaints. I am always so tired. Money slips through my fingers like water. Nothing ever works out for me. They treat language as if it were a harmless diary of their immediate frustrations, completely unaware that every spoken sentence is an active decree sent forth into the matrix of reality. They are casting spells against themselves, binding their own hands with verbal anchors, and then wondering why the universe mirrors their curses back to them with mathematical accuracy. When a master speaks, the mechanics shift entirely. The word is no longer a prayer thrown upward to a distant, indifferent God waiting behind the clouds. It is a sovereign decree issued from the throne room of the heart, setting the wheels of immutable law into instant, unstoppable motion. To master the physics of speech, one must subject the linguistic and psychological mechanics of human expression to a rigorous philosophical breakdown. Why do spoken words possess such formidable creative potency, and how does the human mind trap itself through unconscious verbal conditioning? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the nature of decree. Why do words carry creative power? Because language is the primary tool by which consciousness organizes form out of the formless abyss of potential. And how does a spoken word differ from an unspoken thought? While a thought remains trapped within the private theater of the brain, subject to constant self-doubt and mental ping-pong, a spoken word crosses the threshold from the invisible realm into the physical domain. It vibrates the air molecules of the objective universe, marking its territory in space and time. When an individual speaks a sentence from a state of lack such as crying out, "How will I ever pay this rent?" Recursive thinking reveals the invisible chain reaction. Why did the mouth utter that phrase? Because the mind accepted lack as a fact. And what happens when that phrase is spoken aloud? The ears hear it, the subconscious registers it as an authoritative command, and the emotional body locks the frequency into the nervous system. The universe, acting as a faithful mirror, takes that spoken decree as an order. Give me more of this. Florence Scovel Shinn taught that the game of life is a game of boomerangs. Our thoughts, deeds, and words return to us sooner or later with astounding accuracy. If you send out the energy of trying, pleading, or complaining, the universe returns more things to try, plead, and complain about. Philosophically, this explains why petitionary prayer begging a distant deity to change your circumstances frequently falls flat. When you beg, and you reinforce the distance between yourself and your good, you acknowledge a master and a beggar. A master does not beg, a master decrees. When you speak from acceptance, your words change their texture entirely. They lose their shrill, desperate volume and gain a deep, heavy gravity. You are not trying to convince God to love you or provide for you. You are simply declaring what is already true in the divine mind. The moment your words match your divine inheritance, the boomerang of life changes its flight. The world stops responding to your hard work, your volume, or your sweat. It responds exclusively to the authority of your quiet conviction. The tongue becomes a wand, and the chaos of the outer world dissolves into obedient harmony. Consider the historical account of Dame Beatrice, a master counselor who lived during the rebuilding of the great merchant city of Bristol in an era of severe economic depression. The city docks were choked with rotting timber, bankrupt merchant houses stood locked and barred, and the citizenry wandered the cobbled streets with hollow eyes, muttering curses of poverty and despair. Beatrice's own house was threatened with foreclosure, and her pantry was entirely bare. Yet, those who visited Beatrice's modest stone cottage found an atmosphere of uncanny, unshakable peace. One afternoon, a frantic merchant named Thomas, a man whose ships had been impounded by creditors and whose family faced absolute ruin, burst into Beatrice's parlor. He fell to his knees, weeping and wringing his hands, crying, "Dame Beatrice, we are undone. The market is dead. The magistrates are heartless. I have shouted prayers to the heavens until my voice is gone. Yet every door is slammed in my face. Tell me what magical incantation will force the universe to save us." Beatrice did not offer sympathy, nor did she join him in lamenting the economic gloom. She walked slowly to her wooden writing desk, poured a cup of cool spring water, and set it before the trembling merchant. "Thomas," Beatrice said, her voice steady and clear as a bell, "you are dying of thirst while holding a cup in your hand, because your mouth is too busy cursing the drought to drink." "Curse the drought?" Thomas protested, his voice cracking with hysteria. "I am stating facts. Look at the harbor. Look at the empty ledgers. Are you telling me to lie to myself? I am telling you to stop casting spells against your own life," Beatrice replied softly. "You wake up every morning and shout your poverty into the streets. You tell your neighbors things are impossible. You declare to your soul that you are defeated. You are using your tongue as a whip to lash your own back, and then you cry because your skin is bleeding. The word is your wand, Thomas. It does not know the difference between a joke and a decree. It simply obeys whatever authority you give it." Beatrice handed him a slip of parchment, upon which 3 sentences were written in clear, bold ink. "Stand up," she instructed. "Stop pleading with the sky. Stop describing the shadow. Take this wand of your voice. Look straight into the silence of this room, and speak these words as if the gold were already rattling in your pocket." Thomas looked down at the parchment with shaking hands. Slowly, feeling absurd and awkward, he cleared his throat. He read the words aloud. "I stand still in the quiet certainty that my heart's desire is already a finished work in divine mind. I have received, and I give thanks." At first, his voice was thin and hollow, carrying the heavy tremor of his doubt. Again, Beatrice commanded gently, "Speak it as an owner, not a beggar." Thomas took a deep breath, dropped his shoulders, and spoke it a second time. This time, the words carried weight. They bounced off the stone walls with a strange, resonant authority. He repeated them a third time, his voice dropping into a calm, immovable register. As the final syllable faded into the quiet room, a sharp knock sounded at the heavy oak front door. Thomas jumped in surprise. Beatrice nodded toward the latch. "Go open it." Thomas unlatched the door and pulled it wide. Standing on the stone threshold was a courier from the Royal Admiralty, holding a sealed envelope. The courier bowed and said, "Master Thomas, word has just reached the exchange from the southern ports. The embargo on your vessels has been lifted by royal decree, and your cargo has cleared customs at 3 times its expected value. The port master sent me to find you immediately." Thomas stared at the courier, stunned into absolute silence, the parchment fluttering from his trembling fingers down to the stone floor. The word had acted as a wand, cutting through the dense fog of collective panic and calling forth the reality that was already prepared in the unseen storehouse. To bring this formidable power into your life today, you must revolutionize how you speak to your circumstances. Examine the unconscious vocabulary you deploy when you are stressed. Do you find yourself saying, "I can't afford this, things never go my way," or "I am so exhausted by all this struggling"? Recognize those phrases for what they are: verbal anchors dragging your ship down into the mud of limitation. Today, you take back your wand. When you encounter a tight spot today, whether a delayed email, an unexpected expense, or a sudden wave of fatigue, do not react with a complaint. Do not run to your friends to dissect your anxiety with repetitive, reinforcing tales of woe. Instead, step into a quiet room, or pause right where you stand, and issue your sovereign decree. Speak the words not as a plea, but as an announcement of an established fact. I am divinely guided to my perfect place, among my perfect people, doing my perfect work for my perfect pay. I give thanks that my good now flows to me in a steady, unbroken, ever-increasing stream of success. And I accept it now. Let the words feel heavy. Let them feel solid. Let them settle into your nervous system like a master key turning in a golden lock. The shift is absolute. When your word becomes your wand, the outer world loses its power to dictate your reality. Yet, as you issue your decrees and walk in this newfound authority, a very human question invariably surfaces from the depths of the mind. Why does the physical world sometimes take so long to mirror the inner shift? If the word is a wand and the decree is made, why are the outer circumstances still pointing toward the old horizon for days or weeks afterward? The answers await across the threshold of the next chapter, where the magnificent mechanics of navigating the lag are revealed, teaching you why an ocean liner takes miles to turn its massive frame even after the captain has spun the wheel. The night ocean is a vast, ink-black abyss that stretches infinitely in every direction, meeting a starless horizon where sea and sky blend into a single, seamless shadow. At the center of this watery expanse moves a massive, steel-ribbed ocean liner, a floating city of iron, glass, and polished mahogany, cutting through the heavy swells with slow, majestic authority. High up in the enclosed glass fortress of the wheelhouse, the captain stands alone before the gleaming brass helm. The air is cool, scented with ozone and salt. With a deliberate, unhurried motion, the captain grips the massive wooden wheel and spins it hard to port, altering the vessel's course toward a new destination charted in the stars. Yet, observe the immediate paradox that unfolds across the surface of the water. The moment the wheel is spun, the massive ship does not pivot instantly like a small bird or a nimble rowboat. For several agonizing minutes, the colossal weight of the hull continues on its old trajectory, plowing straight ahead through the dark swells. The foam still churns against the old bow. The compass needle twitches only slowly. To any casual observer standing on the deck, it appears as though nothing has changed at all. If a panicking passenger were standing on the bridge, they might cry out in terror, "You turned the wheel, but we are still heading toward the reef. The ship is unresponsive. The navigation has failed." The captain, however, does not panic. The captain simply smiles, lights a pipe, and rests a steady hand upon the brass rail. Why? Because the captain understands a fundamental law of mass and momentum. The turning of the helm guarantees the changing of the destination. even if the physical body of the ship requires time to catch up with the decision. This is the great trial of the seeker, the terrifying, disorienting interval known as the lag. Most individuals turn the wheel of their acceptance through prayer or decree, but the moment they walk out of their rooms and see the old ocean still stretching out in front of them, they lose their nerve. They scream that the law does not work, wrench the wheel back into panic, and crash directly into the very reef they were trying to avoid. To survive and master the interval of the lag, one must subject the physics of manifestation and psychological timing to a rigorous, philosophical and psychological deconstruction. Why is there a temporal delay between an internal shift in consciousness and its external visibility in the physical world? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the nature of time and density. Why does physical reality take time to catch up with a mental or spiritual decree? Because the material plane operates on a lower, denser frequency of vibration than the realm of pure consciousness. While thought is instantaneous, physical matter possesses inertia, momentum, and established structural density. And how does this temporal lag trap the human mind? By weaponizing sensory feedback against the seeker's faith. When an individual makes an internal shift accepting wealth, health, or love as a present reality, their ego instantly demands immediate sensory validation. Recursive questioning digs deeper. What happens when the ego looks out at the world and finds no physical proof of the shift? Panic ensues. The logical intellect concludes that because the outer mirror has not updated within 24 hours, the inner work was invalid. Philosophically, this error arises from treating current circumstances as active creators rather than passive echoes. As Florence Scovel Shinn observed, the one who is moved by appearances gets nowhere. The one who is unmoved by appearances moves the world. Think of starlight. When you look up at the night sky, many of the brilliant stars you see twinkling above you have already burned out, collapsed, and died millions of years ago. Yet, their light is still traveling through the dark vacuum of space to reach your eyes today. You are literally looking at the past. In the exact same manner, your current financial statement, your current physical health, and your current social standing are merely the starlight of your past beliefs. They are yesterday's news. They are the light of old thoughts traveling through the telescope of time to manifest as your present circumstances. To argue with your current circumstances is as foolish as standing outside at night, shaking your fist at a dead star, and screaming at it to shine differently. You do not fix a shadow on the floor by punching the shadow. You move the light at the source. When you turn the helm of your consciousness, your destination is permanently altered in the divine mind. The miles of old ocean still remaining in front of you are simply the residual momentum of yesterday's beliefs playing themselves out. They are dying stars. They have no power to stop the ship, provided you maintain your course and refuse to panic in the fog. Consider the historical account of Master Vane, the royal master builder of the great cathedral city of Chartres during the medieval rebuilding after a catastrophic fire leveled the old basilica. The city council was desperate, the treasury was drained of silver, and the winter snows were already beginning to dust the rubble-strewn square. Vane was brought before the council to present his blueprints for a magnificent cathedral with soaring stained glass arches that would rival any structure in Christendom. Vane laid his parchment upon the charred table and said quietly, "The cathedral is already built in the mind of the master architect. We shall begin laying the foundation stone on Monday under grace." Yet, for 3 solid months after the foundation stone was laid, the citizens of Chartres saw almost nothing above ground. The workers labored day after day in deep, muddy trenches, digging down into the earth, hauling away wet clay, and pouring massive hidden foundations of stone and mortar. The townspeople grew restless and angry. A delegation of merchants stormed the building site, confronting Vane with fury in their eyes. "Master Vane," their leader shouted, pointing a trembling finger at the empty, muddy pit. "Months have passed. We have spent every remaining coin on your workers. Where is the cathedral? All we see is mud, trenches, and wet stone. The winter is here, and we are still worshipping in the open air among the ruins. You have deceived us." Vane did not raise his voice. He laid down his trowel, wiped his hands on a clean linen cloth, and walked calmly to the edge of the deep trench, inviting the merchants to look down. closely, Vane said softly. You see mud because your eyes are looking at the preparation. You see a pit because the earth must make room for the footings of a structure that will touch the clouds. If I had built the cathedral instantly upon the surface without digging deep into the dark soil, the first winter gale would have blown the spires into dust. The unseen work is where the destiny is forged. The cathedral is already finished in the heavens. It is merely climbing its way up through the mud to meet your eyes. The merchant scoffed, calling him a madman, and threatened to tear down his scaffolding. But Vane refused to change the plans, and his workers continued laying stone in the dark trenches, completely unmoved by the complaints of the crowd. 2 years later, when the great soaring arches finally broke through the surface of the earth and rose into the sky in a breathtaking symphony of stone and light, it became the eighth wonder of the world. Those who had cursed the mud were the first to weep at its beauty, having forgotten that every magnificent visible reality must first spend time germinating in the dark womb of the lag. To bring this profound patience into your daily walk, you must radically redefine how you interpret delays. When you make your inner shift today, when you declare you're good, put on the new garment, and set your course, and the external world refuses to change by tomorrow evening, do not panic, do not rush back to the helm to yank the ship around in a frantic circle. Recognize the delay for what it is, the turning radius of a massive life. The old momentum of your past habits, fears, and financial routines has its own residual velocity. It takes time for the ship of your destiny to swing its heavy frame toward the new horizon. Every time an old bill arrives, every time an old symptom flickers, every time a closed door presents itself, look at it with the cool, detached amusement of a captain watching a wave break against the hull. Say to yourself, that is merely the residual wash of yesterday's ocean. My destination is already fixed in the stars. The ship has turned, and the new shore is arriving under grace. State your unshakable patience as you prepare to cross this threshold. Let the stillness of the deep ocean settle over your spirit. The lag is not a punishment, it is the proof of the inner transformation quietly taking root beneath the surface of the world. Yet, as the ship cuts through the dark water toward the unseen dawn, a final, beautiful transformation occurs within the soul of the traveler. The frantic seeker is gone, replaced by someone who no longer needs to hunt for peace because they have finally come home. What does it feel like to cross that final threshold? What is the profound sigh of relief that echoes through the halls of an awakened heart? The final chapter awaits across the golden boundary of the next page, where the great homecoming is revealed, and the game of life is won forever. The hour is twilight, that liminal space where the fiery gold of the setting sun bleeds into the deep, velvety purple of an approaching summer night. A traveler walks slowly down a winding country lane, carrying the physical and emotional scars of a decades-long pilgrimage. The traveler's boots are caked in the dust of 1,000 foreign roads. The cloak is frayed at the hems, heavy with the moisture of storms weathered alone. Every muscle aches with the profound fatigue of a wanderer who has spent a lifetime searching for a kingdom that always seemed just one horizon beyond reach. Ahead, nestled in a sheltered valley of rolling green hills, a small stone cottage comes into view. Smoke curls lazily from its stone chimney, carrying the rich, familiar scent of burning cedar and baking bread. Through the small, leaded glass windows, a warm golden light spills out onto the darkening grass. The traveler reaches the wooden gate, pushes it open, and walks up the flagstone path. There is no frantic knocking, no desperate plea shouted at the door. The hand reaches out, turns the brass latch which opens effortlessly, because it was never locked from the inside, and steps across the threshold. Inside, the fire crackles softly in the hearth. A clean pair of soft leather slippers rests by the rug. A hot meal sits warming upon the wooden table. The traveler closes the heavy oak door against the cold world outside, drops the heavy, fraying travel cloak onto a peg, and lets out a long, slow, shuddering sigh, the deep, beautiful, echoing sigh of one who has finally come home and kicked off their shoes. In that single breath, the frantic seeker vanishes. The years of striving, of reading books in the amber lamplight, of forcing visualizations, of crying over unmoving ledgers and empty chairs, dissolve into nothingness. The search is over. There is nowhere else to go. To understand the profound metaphysical weight of this homecoming, one must subject the psychology of the spiritual seeker to a rigorous philosophical autopsy. Why do human beings spend decades wandering through deserts of their own making, searching externally for what has always inhabited the sanctuary of their own core? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the archetype of the spiritual pilgrim. Why does the seeker feel compelled to travel through endless layers of study, discipline, and effort? Because the ego is convinced that peace, abundance, and love are commodities located in a distant territory that must be earned through trial. And how does this journey perpetuate the illusion of separation? By treating the self as a broken fragment that needs to be repaired, polished, and upgraded before it is worthy of grace. When an individual wakes up to the truth of their divine inheritance, a radical psychological fracture occurs. Recursive questioning digs deeper. What is the core realization that shatters the cycle of seeking? The realization that you are not a broken human being trying to fix yourself, nor are you a poor soul trying to get rich, nor a lonely entity trying to manufacture love. You are a divine being who has simply been dreaming a deeply convincing, highly detailed dream of lack, struggle, and separation. When a person has a nightmare, when they dream they are trapped in a dark dungeon, pursued by phantom terrors, crying out in terror, they do not need to construct a new dungeon wall or fight the phantom with physical weapons to find relief. They simply need to wake up. Philosophically, this exposes the ultimate joke of the spiritual path. All the books read, all the affirmations chanted through clenched teeth, all the white-knuckled visualizations performed at midnight were not tools used to create a new reality. They were merely the complex mental gymnastics required to exhaust the ego until it finally stopped resisting what was already there. The divine mind does not judge your choices, nor does it require you to pay penance for your years of struggling. It simply fulfills your acceptances. If you accept that you are a wanderer, it provides the desert. If you accept that you are an heir returning to a house that was prepared before the stars were lit, it provides the banquet. To sigh, the sigh of coming home, is to recognize that you no longer have to make anything happen. You only have to let it happen. The good already exists in the divine mind in its infinite, unalterable perfection. When you stop trying to build the house and simply walk through the open door, the struggle evaporates like morning mist under the summer sun. Consider the ancient parable of the prodigal heir, recorded in the secret scrolls of the desert elders. A young prince, gripped by a sudden, restless urge to test his own strength, took his inheritance from his father's treasury, left the marble halls of the capital, and journeyed into a far country. There, surrounded by false companions and illusory pleasures, he spent every coin he owned. When famine struck the land, the prince found himself clothed in rags, tending swine in a muddy pit, eating husks alongside the beasts. Every night, shivering in the filth, he would weep and try to invent schemes to win back his wealth. He would close his eyes and try to force his mind to feel the silk of royal robes. He would huff and puff, shouting commands to the empty air, trying to prove to himself that he was still a king. Yet the mud remained cold and the hunger remained sharp. One evening, exhausted to the very marrow of his bones, the prince stopped fighting. He dropped his head into his hands, let go of all his frantic mental striving, and remembered the quiet halls of his father's house. He remembered that even the lowest servants in his father's household had bread enough to spare. While he sat perishing in the dirt of his own making, he did not try to manufacture a crown out of mud. He did not create a new plan to earn his way back into the king's favor through hard labor. He simply made a quiet, unshakable decision. I will arise, walk down the road, and accept the home that is already mine. He stood up, left the swine pit behind, and began the long walk back down the dusty road. As he crested the final hill before the capital, ragged, thin, and barefoot, his father saw him from afar. The king did not wait at the throne room doors with an accountant's ledger to demand an audit of how the inheritance was squandered. The king ran down the marble steps, threw his arms around the ragged youth, and wept. Before the prince could stammer out his rehearsed speech of repentance and plea for a job as a hired servant, the king shouted to his attendants, "Quick, bring the finest robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead, and is alive again. He was lost, and is found. The prince did not earn the robe. He did not construct the feast. He simply stopped running, walked through the open gate, and accepted the homecoming that his father's love had prepared for him the moment he turned his face toward home. To bring this ultimate realization into your daily life today, you must grant yourself permission to rest. You have carried the weight of trying for far too long. You have studied, you have visualized, you have strained your eyes against the dark, and you have beaten your chest when the outer mirror failed to shift instantly to your command. Tonight, let it all go. As you prepare to rest, imagine the heavy travel cloak of your anxieties sliding off your shoulders and dropping to the floor. Imagine walking into the warm, lit cottage of your divine inheritance. Kick off the heavy boots of struggle. Let out that long, slow, beautiful sigh of relief. If you are ready to stop wandering in the desert of effort and finally step across the threshold into your true divine inheritance, take a sacred pause right now. Tap the subscribe button as a permanent marker of your homecoming, a public seal that you are no longer a wandering seeker, but a rightful heir resting in the absolute peace of your Father's house. The shift is total. The journey of the seeker has ended because the seeker has discovered they were never lost. They were only dreaming. Yet, as the fire crackles softly in the hearth and the night deepens around the cottage, a final, exhilarating test presents itself at the edge of the mind. How do we prove this mastery when the dawn breaks? What is the final? A practical experiment that bridges the unseen reality into the tactile world of 7 days? The final mystery awaits across the threshold of the ultimate chapter, where the 7-day test is revealed and the game of life is won forever. The chamber is cast in the amber, cathedral quiet of dawn. Dust motes drift lazily through shafts of golden light piercing the high-arched windows, and the world outside holds its breath in the pristine silence before the morning bell tolls. Seated at a heavy oak table in the center of the room is a traveler who has walked the entire length of this vast internal pilgrimage. The travel-worn cloak is gone, the heavy boots of struggle have been set aside. In their place is the quiet, immovable composure of one who has finally crossed the threshold of the homecoming cottage and warmed their hands by the hearth. Suddenly, the heavy oak door swings open with a silent, effortless motion. A celestial messenger stands upon the threshold, cloaked in the deep, radiant blue of the morning sky, holding a sealed parchment bound with a ribbon of spun gold. The messenger steps forward, places the parchment upon the wooden table, and speaks with a voice that sounds like the rolling of distant, peaceful thunder. Hearken, beloved. Let the games of striving cease, for the decree has been issued in the archives of the infinite. Consider this day as the dawning of a guaranteed reality. Your heart's desire, every true, deeply held aspiration of your soul, is already a finished, unalterable work in the divine mind. It is locked in place, and it shall manifest in the outer world with mathematical precision in exactly 7 days. Not a moment sooner, not a second later. The messenger bows slightly, turns, and dissolves into the morning mist, leaving the parchment gleaming upon the table. Now, observe the profound paradox that tests the soul of the traveler in this precise cinematic moment. If a messenger from the divine stood before you right now and offered an ironclad, indisputable guarantee that your heart's desire was already granted and would appear in the physical world in exactly 7 days, how would you spend the hours remaining in this afternoon? Would you pace the floorboards with frantic anxiety, biting your fingernails down to the quick? Would you rush to the window every 5 minutes, glaring at the empty street, demanding to know where the delivery is? Would you scream at the shadows, panic over your bank balance, or weep over the emptiness of the chair across from you? No. Such behavior would mark a mind gripped by madness or profound disbelief. If you truly knew with the absolute, unshakable certainty of a master that the check was already signed, sealed, and waiting in the mail with a 7-day delivery stamp, your entire demeanor would transform instantly. You would pour a cup of tea. You would sit back in your armchair. You would smile with the deep, effortless relaxation of someone who is no longer waiting for a miracle, but simply waiting for an appointment. To master the ultimate integration of this teaching, one must subject the psychology of absolute certainty to a rigorous philosophical and psychological autopsy. Why does human consciousness struggle so violently to rest in the assurance of a guaranteed future, and how does the human ego sabotage its own peace through the addiction of worry? Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to the mechanics of trust. Why does the unawakened mind instinctively reject certainty and default to panic? Because the ego's primary survival mechanism is vigilance. It believes that if it stops worrying, scanning the horizon for danger, and micromanaging the future, disaster will strike. And how does this vigilance destroy the creative process? By introducing a frequency of desperate lack that constantly cancels out the very blessing being sought. When an individual receives a guarantee, whether from a universal law or a celestial messenger, their ego immediately demands to inspect the mechanics of how the promise will be fulfilled. Recursive questioning digs deeper. Why does the human mind obsess over the how and the when? Because the ego is addicted to control. It wants to act as the general, the architect, and the delivery driver all at once. It cannot fathom a universe that operates with silent, benevolent efficiency without requiring human sweat, panic, and operational interference. Philosophically, this exposes the core difference between the amateur seeker and the master creator. The amateur treats life like a combat zone, where every inch of ground must be fought for with bloody hands. The master treats life like an unfolding tapestry whose pattern has already been woven in perfection by the infinite. When you accept the 7-day test, you cross an invisible bridge in human evolution. You realize that worry is not a virtue. It is an insult to the divine mind. To worry about a prayer that has already been answered in the unseen is equivalent to a guest arriving at a royal banquet, walking into the kitchen, and screaming at the chef because the roast is still in the oven, even though the host has already assured them the feast is prepared. The divine mind does not need your anxiety to complete its work. It requires only your stillness. When you step into the frequency of the 7-day guarantee, your nervous system undergoes a miraculous alchemy. The tightness in your chest dissolves. The frantic reaching in your mind ceases. You begin to act, walk, and breathe like a sovereign whose kingdom is already secure. You prepare your life for the guest you know is coming, clearing space in the closet, setting an extra place at the table, writing the thank you note in your heart before the ink of the outer world has even dried. Consider the historical account of Master Gideon, the royal clockmaker to the court of Aragon during a period of sweeping political unrest. Gideon was commissioned by the king to craft the grand astronomical clock of the cathedral tower, a masterpiece of intricate gears, gold weights, and celestial dials that would track the movements of the stars for 1,000 years. The deadline given by the crown was precisely 30 days. If the clock failed to strike the hour of noon on the 30th day, Gideon and his entire guild would be cast into exile. During the first 20 days, Gideon's apprentices worked in a state of frantic, screaming terror. They shouted at one another, dropped delicate gears on the stone floor, wept over misaligned springs, and stayed awake for 72 hours straight, huffing and puffing over the workbench, convinced that if their hands shook for a single second, the entire mechanism would fail. As a result, every gear they forged warped under the thermal shock, and the clock remained a chaotic heap of useless brass. On the 21st day, an old master clockmaker from the eastern deserts, traveling through the city, visited Gideon's workshop. He watched the sweating, screaming apprentices, throwing tools across the room, and shaking with exhaustion. The old master walked up to Gideon, who sat with his head buried in his hands, trembling with despair, and whispered, "My son, why do you treat the clock like an enemy you must conquer with your panic? You are building this machine as if the universe were trying to stop you at every turn." Gideon sobbed, "We have only 9 days left. The gears are warped, the springs are broken. If we do not force this machine to finish, we are ruined." The old master smiled gently, took the frantic builder by the shoulders, and sat him down in a comfortable chair by the window. "Listen to me," the old master said with absolute, immovable authority. "Suppose a decree came from the king this very second. promising you that whether you touched a tool today or slept for 9 days straight, the clock would magically assemble itself and strike noon with absolute perfection on the 30th day. How would you spend this afternoon? Gideon blinked through his tears. I would sleep. I would clean my workshop. I would drink tea with my family. Then do it, the old master instructed. Stop forcing the gears. Stop screaming at the brass. The master clockmaker of the universe has already designed time itself. Step back, trust the unseen mechanism, and let the clock assemble itself through your quiet acceptance. Gideon took a deep, shuddering breath. He looked at his panicked apprentices and said simply, "Put down the hammers. We are done striving. We are going to clean the shop, and we are going to rest." The apprentices stared at him as if he had lost his mind. But Gideon walked to his desk, sat down, and spent the remaining 9 days in calm, serene silence, inspecting the tools with quiet detachment, resting his eyes, and breathing with the steady rhythm of a man who already heard the bells ringing in his mind. On the 30th day, the city gathered in the square below the cathedral tower, holding their breath. At precisely 12 noon, the great bronze doors of the tower swung open, and the magnificent astronomical clock struck the hour with a tone so pure, so resonant, and so breathtakingly precise that the entire crowd fell to their knees in awe. The machine had not been built by the frantic sweat of the 20 days of panic. It had been brought forth by the 9 days of absolute, unshakable rest in the certainty of the finished work. As we stand at the culmination of this profound cinematic manuscript, the journey comes to its magnificent, luminous climax. You are no longer the traveler shivering in the dark, trying to catch smoke with bare hands. You are no longer the woodcutter, hauling logs up a mountain of struggle, nor the beggar, screaming at a mirror, nor the frantic actor, tearing off the royal velvet in fear. You are the heir. You are the master who has put down the heavy tools of effort and taken up the simple, beautiful mantle of quiet acceptance. As you step out of this space and back into the unfolding theater of your daily life, carry this final truth anchored like a golden compass in your chest. The game is won. The door is wide open. Your good already exists in the divine mind, waiting for your acceptance to flow into visibility under grace and in perfect ways. Do not look back at the old shadows. Do not argue with yesterday's newspaper. Walk through your world today with the quiet, boring, absolute conviction of one who knows that their house is built on a rock, their name is written upon the place card at the banquet, and their destiny is fixed in the stars. Breathe deep, drop your shoulders, let out that long, beautiful sigh of coming home. And so it is.